My husband just passed away yesterday. Today, my son looked me straight in the face and said, "You should leave. This is no longer your home." I stood there, frozen, but I didn't beg. I simply reached into my coat pocket and pulled out something he never expected. My name is Margaret Bennett. I am 68 years old. My husband passed away 2 weeks ago from a heart attack during dinner with the family. We were married for nearly 43 years. All that time, I thought I knew what the rest of our lives would look like. Richard and I would retire peacefully, take care of each other in sickness, and teach our grandchildren how to garden in the memory-filled backyard. But after my husband's funeral, the world around me changed so quickly I could barely keep up. The funeral was held on a rainy Saturday morning. Many people came to offer condolences. Richard's former colleagues, old neighbors, friends from church. I stood next to our son, Ethan, trying to smile and thank everyone, even though my heart felt like a cold, hollow space. Ethan is our only child. He was always a good boy, studious, respectful, never caused us serious trouble. Later, he studied law, became a well-known lawyer in the area, and married a woman named Samantha, the one I've always called the polite but distant wife. 3 days after the funeral, once the guests had all left, I was cleaning up the altar and the last meal in the house. Ethan walked into the kitchen. No greeting, no look of sympathy. He stood in front of me and said, in a clear, firm voice, "Mom, it's time for you to find another place to live. This is my house now." I was stunned. At first, I thought I had misheard him. I asked again, trying to stay calm. "What did you say, dear?" He repeated it, this time more slowly and firmly. He said this house now belonged to him, according to the will his father signed before he passed. He told me I should make arrangements to move out within the next 2 weeks to avoid making things uncomfortable for both sides. I turned to look at Samantha, my daughter-in-law, who was sitting in the living room sipping tea. She looked up at me with eyes that held almost no emotion, as if I were an uninvited guest who had overstayed her welcome. I said nothing more. I simply nodded, walked to my room, and closed the door. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt my heart sink, as if something inside me had quietly cracked. Richard and I had spent over 20 years paying off this house together. I still kept every bank statement, every receipt. I thought Ethan would understand, or at least wait until I could catch my breath. But no, he was ready for me to leave before the air had even cleared. I sat down at the edge of the bed and reached for the small tin box where I kept important documents. In that moment, something began to stir inside me, not anger, not despair. It was a feeling that was sharp and clear. I needed to know what had happened, and I wasn't going to leave in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the bed Richard and I had shared for 40 years, listening to the ticking clock, thinking about the past few months. Those scattered fragments of memory that now came back vividly. Richard had changed during his last year. He sighed a lot, spoke less, and often forgot small things. I always assumed it was just age, his heart condition, or the pressure of finishing work before retirement. I didn't think much of it. I remembered one night, just a few weeks before he died. Richard woke up in the middle of the night and sat silently in the living room, staring out at the backyard. I came down to get some water and saw him holding a stack of papers. When I asked, he startled, shoved the papers into a drawer, and said it was just some loose ends from the old company. I didn't push him. That was my mistake. I also remembered the times Ethan came to visit. But instead of staying for dinner like he used to, he always found an excuse to leave early. Whenever I asked about work or his marriage, he gave vague answers. Samantha barely spoke to me at all, always polite, but nothing more. The last time our whole family had dinner together was 1 month before Richard passed. The atmosphere that evening was strange. Richard was distracted, Ethan kept checking his watch, and Samantha stared at her phone the entire meal. When I suggested we take our annual family summer trip together, as usual, no one responded positively. Ethan only said, "It might not be a good time this year, Mom." I thought they were just busy. I didn't realize they had other plans, plans that didn't include me. The morning after I was asked to leave, I began opening every file folder, every drawer, every letter I had kept over the years. One question echoed in my mind. How could this house, the home Richard and I built together from the earliest days, suddenly belong entirely to our son after just one funeral? I pulled out the original property deed. Just as I remembered, the house was under both our names, Richard's and mine, as joint owners. But when I compared it to the copy Ethan had left in an envelope yesterday, it appeared a new will had been made, transferring full ownership of the property to our son. I wasn't mentioned, not a single line. And what shocked me the most, the date on the will, exactly 3 weeks before Richard died. I set the paper down on the table. There's no way Richard would have done that. Not without a word. Not without a conversation. It couldn't be. Unless I suddenly remembered the worried look on his face the week before his doctor's visit, his unusually firm grip when he held my hand, and the quiet words he whispered, thinking I was asleep. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I didn't have a choice." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, I was starting to feel afraid. I realized I needed help, and I knew exactly who to go to. I never imagined there would come a day when I'd need to find a lawyer to fight for the house where I had scrubbed every brick with my own hands. But that afternoon, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old friend, Louise Chandler. Louise and I had known each other since our teaching days. Later, she switched careers and became a lawyer specializing in retirement and real estate. Though she had retired a few years ago, I knew that if anyone understood the law and would stand by me, it was Louise. When I explained everything over the phone, Louise was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Maggie, stay calm. Bring all the documents and come see me. This isn't going to be simple." The next afternoon, I sat in Louise's living room and spread all the papers across the table. The property deed, the old will from 2001 that Richard and I signed together, our joint savings book, and the new will Ethan had left in the envelope. Louise reviewed each item carefully, saying nothing for nearly half an hour. Then she looked up, removed her glasses, and asked, "Are you absolutely sure you never signed any amendments?" I shook my head. I had no idea Richard made a new will. I don't even understand how my half of the house just disappeared. Louise looked at me, her expression serious. It's possible Richard was pressured. Or worse, he may not have been legally competent when he signed this. This document has several red flags. After that conversation, we began our investigation. Louise asked an old colleague to help track down Richard's medical records from the weeks before he passed. We discovered that he had been hospitalized twice, with notes indicating mild confusion and cognitive decline. Enough, perhaps, for a court to question the validity of the new will. At the same time, Louise hired a private investigator to learn more about the lawyer who drafted Richard's new will, and it turned out this lawyer had professional ties to Ethan, having worked at the same law firm several years ago. I started to realize everything had been planned. Not long after, We discovered another chilling detail. The new will did not include me as a witness, nor did it carry my signature, even though I was Richard's legal wife. All the witnesses were connected to Ethan, and the signing had taken place at Ethan's private residence, a place I was never invited to. I sat in Louise's office, staring at a copy of that will, and whispered, "They erased me from his life, even before he was gone." Louise placed a hand on my shoulder. "No, Maggie, they only think they did. But now you have to stand up, not to hold on to the house, but to reclaim your dignity." We began the legal proceedings. Louise drafted a motion to the court requesting a suspension of any transfer or sale of assets, while simultaneously filing a lawsuit to challenge the validity of the new will, along with medical evidence and suspicion of coercion. I said nothing to Ethan, not to Samantha. I kept packing my things, as if I were leaving. I still cooked breakfast, as usual, but inside, I was preparing for a silent legal battle they had no idea was approaching. The first hearing was scheduled for Monday, 10 a.m. at the Montgomery County Courthouse. I arrived early, sitting alone in the car for nearly 15 minutes before stepping inside. Inside the courthouse, I saw Ethan and Samantha standing with a young lawyer, well-dressed, confident. Ethan glanced at me, but didn't nod, didn't say a word. He simply turned away, as if I had never been the one who gave him life and raised him for 35 years. I didn't blame him at that moment, but I reminded myself I wasn't here today to fight over a house. I came to reclaim justice for myself and for Richard. My lawyer, Louise, opened the hearing by submitting the original will, drafted in 2001, signed by both Richard and me, notarized with 2 clear witnesses. That version split all assets equally between spouses, and in the event of one's death, the share remained unchanged. It didn't automatically pass to heirs. Louise then submitted Richard's medical records from the last 3 months of his life, which included notes from a psychiatrist about cognitive decline, even signs of temporal disorientation and lapses in recalling personal details. She went on to argue that on the day the new will was signed, Richard was under home care, and there was no evidence proving he had legal capacity at the time. The whole signing process was rushed, done at Ethan's home, and I, the legal wife, was neither informed nor involved. Ethan's lawyer objected, claiming there was no proof Richard had been coerced. But then Louise presented the final piece of evidence, a statement from the home health care worker who had looked after Richard in his final weeks. That caregiver confirmed Ethan and Samantha often handed Richard documents to sign without explaining clearly, and each signing happened while Richard was drowsy or exhausted from medication. One time, she even overheard Richard whisper, "I'm not sure what I'm signing, but they said I had to keep the peace." The courtroom fell silent. I didn't look at Ethan. I only looked down at my own 2 tightly clasped hands. The hands that once taught him to write, cooked every meal for him, held his hand on his first day of college. The judge issued a temporary ruling, suspending the validity of the new will, ordering further investigation, and maintaining the current status of the assets until an official judgment is made. Outside the courtroom after the hearing, Ethan walked up to me. His voice was low, but he couldn't hide the bitterness. "Are you really trying to turn this into a public disgrace for the whole family?" I lifted my head. "What family, Ethan?" "The one that threw me out of my house 3 days after my husband's funeral." Samantha pulled her husband away. I stood there alone, feeling both relieved and burdened. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid anymore. 3 weeks after the initial hearing, the court convened for the final trial. During that time, Louise's legal team submitted more documents regarding the joint assets between Richard and me, from savings accounts and bonds to the retirement fund he never got to claim. We were co-owners of almost everything. They also uncovered a key detail. The new will had not been officially registered according to state procedure, and the date appeared to be tampered with in the original file. On Ethan's side, his lawyer began to soften, proposing an out-of-court settlement, suggesting that Ethan would keep the house in exchange for me receiving the equivalent value in inheritance. Louise asked for my opinion. I stayed silent for a long time before I answered. I don't need their compromise. I need a clear verdict. No more out-of-court deals. And the court gave its verdict that Thursday morning in a quiet room where every emotion seemed tightly compressed. The new will was invalid. The original will was fully reinstated. I retained my share of the house, and the joint assets were to be divided exactly as originally agreed upon by Richard and me. Ethan said nothing. Samantha stood up and walked out as soon as the judge finished speaking. Louise turned to me and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just felt one thing clear and solid. I was no longer afraid of being seen as a troublemaker. I had stood up, and this time I stood up for myself. But victory doesn't always mean keeping everything. 1 week after the verdict, I went to the bank and withdrew all of my share, cash, bonds, savings accounts. I hired an independent lawyer to sell my share of the house without informing Ethan. I knew that living under the same roof, even with divided rights, was no longer something that should continue. I no longer needed to fight to stay in a place that had long ceased to be a home. I used the money to buy a small cabin near the Maine coast, where Richard once said he wanted to retire with me. A quiet place with morning sunlight and the scent of pine when it rains. I also joined a volunteer group that reads books to lonely seniors, something I had always dreamed of doing after retirement but never had the chance. One day, a new neighbor asked me, "Do you live alone? Where are your children?" I smiled and answered softly, "They have their own lives, and so do I." I no longer felt angry at Ethan. I understood that some children grow up, succeed, and then forget their roots. I just felt sad that in this life some lessons can only be taught by walking away. I still keep our wedding photo in the living room, where Richard is smiling at me in his old suit. Every morning, I sit and look at him while sipping tea and quietly think, I've preserved what we built together. And now, I choose to let go for peace. Ending, a message to the audience. Sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is to refuse silence, not to seek revenge, but to remind others that even family has boundaries. And respect, if not preserved, must be reclaimed.